You wake in the dusky chill of an Athenian dawn. The city is unusually quietous, normal hum of merchants, students, and wandering philosophers muffled under the shadow of what's to come. The year is 399 BCE, and the world is preparing to lose one of its most peculiar minds. Socrates. You might imagine that a man condemned to die would be pacing, sweating, praying perhaps, but in a dim prison chamber just off the bustling agora, Socrates is calmly discussing the nature of the soul with his closest followers. And sandals, speaking softly as the rising sun streaks golden fingers through the barred window, corrupting the youth and impiety. Not murder, not theft, simply the act of stirring doubt in the minds of young Athenians and disrespecting the traditional gods of the city. There are no chains on his wrists, no guards yelling, just a man sitting cross-legged, surrounded by scrolls. Socrates, by most accounts, was not handsome, bald-headed, with bulging eyes and a snub nose. He looked more like a curious turtle than a respected intellectual. Just a jury of 500 citizens seated on wooden benches, listening to speakers argue their case. Then came the vote on punishment. Plato, his most famous student, isn't present, allegedly sick that day, but others like Crito and Phaedo are a simple ceramic bowl filled with a cloudy green Mixticonium maculatum, better known as hemlock, derived from a wild plant with white flowers. It attacks the nervous system, beginning with paralysis of the legs, then slowly climbing until the lungs forget how to breathe. There is no violence, no blood, just silence. They engage him in a dialogue about the immortality of the soul. "I owe a rooster to Asclepius," he says. "Make sure to pay the debt," a nod to the god of healing. Some scholars think he meant it ironically. Others interpret it as a belief that death itself was a cure for life's suffering. Even now, hours from death, Socrates is teaching. Death by hemlock. The chill in the room is no longer just from the stone walls, but from the gradual stillness taking hold of his limbs. His chest rises slightly. Then it does not. And the end of a life built entirely on asking, why? A poisonous drink. Did he truly believe death was nothing to fear, or was it easier to face death than to betray his method? The recognition at the end of his speaking, his questioning, his being, lies at the bottom of this cup. Then he lies down. A slave checks his feet. "Do you feel them?" Socrates shakes his head. The numbness is creeping up. Quick, civilized Athenian. He didn't grovel. In fact, when asked what punishment he deserved if found guilty, he suggests that he should be rewarded with free meals for life in the Prytanium, the city's dining hall for honored guests. Yet in the philosophical world of Athens, his mind was sharp enough to cut marble. He didn't write books or command armies. Instead, he asked questions, often annoying ones, the kind that made powerful men squirm, and that ultimately was his downfall. The charges brought against him seemed quaint by modern standards. Athens, barely recovered from its loss in the Peloponnesian War, was fragile. He responds, in typical fashion, "You may bury me if you can catch me." A reminder, perhaps, that he did not believe the body was the self. The "so what" really mattered was moving on. The democracy that had flourished before the war had been bruised by oligarchic rule, Spartan dominance, and civil unrest. Socrates, who openly challenged popular opinion and associated with known oligarchs, found himself in dangerous political territory. His method of questioning, called the elenchus, or Socratic method, had once been an academic novelty, but now, too many Athenians, it felt like a threat. Still, when you picture his trial, don't imagine a modern court. The Athenian legal system was almost theatrical. There were no lawyers, no judges in robes. It didn't go over well. The jury convicted him by a narrow margin. Now, you sit with him in the final hours. The cup sits quietly on the floor. Beside a slave, Socrates is not rushed. He bathes, he talks, he jokes. The servant hands him the cup. Here, the mood shifts. You notice a flicker, just a brief hesitation as Socrates grips the bowl. It's not fear, exactly. It's gravity. But Socrates drinks, without grimace or complaint, slowly, deliberately. His friends weep openly. They ask how they should bury him. As the poison begins its work, Socrates walks for a bit, as instructed, to help the liquid circulate. Minutes pass. The silence grows heavier. And yet, even here, Socrates is speaking calmly, observing his own death with curiosity. No gasps, no final scream, just the slowing of breath. Why did Socrates go so willingly? Was it conviction in his ideals or a subtle protest? Was the Athenian democracy defending its values or silencing one of the last voices who challenged it? As the coldness crept up Socrates' legs in that quiet prison room, the city beyond was already stirring. Merchants opened stalls, students gathered in the shade and the sun lifted itself over the Acropolis like it always had. Life, after all, did not pause for even the most philosophical of deaths. But something had shifted. A seed was planted not in the ground where his body would be buried, but in the minds of those who had heard him speak, who had felt the discomfort of his questions, who had watched him drink that fatal cup not with fear, but with composure. The death of Socrates was not merely an execution, it was a public idea, unfolding in real time. To understand how Socrates ended up in that prison, you must understand the Athens of his time, not the Athens of Pericles' golden age, full of statues and stage plays, but the Athens nursing fresh wounds from war and political chaos. Only a few years earlier, Athens had suffered a humiliating defeat to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Its democracy had been briefly dismantled by the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime supported by Sparta, and in those dark months, blood flowed freely. Many of Socrates' former students, Critias, among them, were part of that repressive government. When democracy was restored, the people of Athens were eager to stabilize the ship. They granted amnesty to many who had supported the tyrants, but they hadn't forgotten. Socrates had no lawyer. He spoke for himself, and Plato later recorded a version of his speech in the Apology. Instead of weeping, they watched those who had ties to the past regime with suspicion. I at least know that I do not know. And then there was Socrates who, though he claimed no allegiance to any party, had openly criticized the democratic process and had once defied a democratic order during a prior regime. He mocked his accusers, compared himself to a gadfly that stung Athens awake, and warned them that killing him would not silence the spirit of inquiry. A haunting prelude, perhaps, to what was about to come. But then came the second vote, the one that truly mattered. What should the punishment be? Why? Because he had done the city a service by provoking thought and seeking truth. Bribes could be arranged. Routes were available. Socrates could live quietly in exile. Had Socrates fled, perhaps he would have taught elsewhere, lived longer. But would his story echo through the ages? But Socrates refused. His accusers, particularly Anytus, were vilified. Plays and stories softened toward the philosopher they had once condemned. Instead, Lycan brought charges that felt softer, but struck deeper. The image of a man choosing principle over self-preservation has haunted thinkers for centuries. He was corrupting the youth. For nearly a month, Socrates remained in prison, visited by friends, debating death, soul, and virtue. Socrates could have proposed to exile. The second vote was more decisive. A larger majority sentenced him to die. He would rather die than undermine the philosophical life he had lived so publicly, or a fine, or even silence. He did not believe in the gods of the city. He introduced strange divinities of his own. The trial took place in the Agora, where hundreds of citizens gathered not as spectators, but as jurors. It became a statement. You must imagine this old man, unwashed and plain, standing calmly before a hostile crowd. Instead of pleading, he challenged. "I am wiser than this man," he said of one respected politician. "For neither of us knows anything of great value, but he thinks he knows something he does not." To the jurors, it may have sounded clever, or arrogant, or both. He ended with the idea that no evil can happen to a good man. either in life or after death. When the jury voted, it was close. Around 280 votes to convict and 220 to acquit. His accusers asked for death. Instead, he offered something remarkable. He suggested he should be rewarded with free meals for life, like an Olympic victor or public benefactor. To some, this was the ultimate insult. But his execution was delayed. As custom dictated, no execution could take place during the sacred sailing of the ship to Delos, a religious voyage to honor Apollo. During that time, his friend Credo begged him to escape. He believed that to flee would be to betray the very principles he had taught, that the law, even when flawed, must be respected or society crumbles. This refusal, this choice made his death more than a state-sanctioned punishment. Consider the implications. Instead, he remained, drank, died, and that death, recorded by Plato, became the cornerstone of Western philosophy. But what of Athens? In killing Socrates, did they preserve democracy or stain it? A few years later, the Athenians themselves seemed unsure. A sense of guilt began to settle. Statues of Socrates were so we are left to wonder, was Socrates a martyr of truth or simply a man too difficult to tolerate during turbulent times? Did his death strengthen the ideals of inquiry or prove that even democracies have fragile limits? The image of Socrates' final moments lingers not as tragedy, but as enigma. His breath faded, his eyes closed, and the hemlock's chill crept past his chest. In a room full of students, friends, and followers, silence took hold. The walls echo faintly with his voice, as though the space itself remembers. And beyond that cell, the sun continues to rise, as it always does. But something subtle has shifted, not just in Athens, but in the world that would come after. No frantic cries, no collapse, just a man accepting death like a friend long expected. It was simple, still, philosophical to the end. You sit in that small chamber, the scent of clay and old wool lingering in the air. We often think of death as a momentan event with these dialogues, though stylized and philosophical, preserve the tone of the man, not just his words, but his spirit. But Socrates' death, in many ways, did not truly end with a cup of hemlock. It began there. Like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples would travel outward across time, distorting and shaping civilizations long after the man himself was gone. Plato, his student, observer, and inheritor, made sure of that. For Christians, he became a prefigurement of Christ, unjustly condemned, calm in the face of death. Speaking of a soul beyond the body, it was Plato who wrote Apology, Phaedo, and Credo, framing Socrates' final days as a trilogy of principle, resistance, and acceptance. Socrates became not just a person, but an archetype. His method, questioning assumptions, examining one's beliefs, became the bedrock of Western education. The questioner, the martyr of reason, the one who dared to disturb the comfortable. Yet, it's important to remember, Socrates himself never wrote a single word. Everything we know of him comes from others, from Plato's reverent recording, from Xenophon's more grounded recollections. Others said his death gave weight to everything he had ever said. That in dying, he taught his final and most unforgettable lesson. From Aristophanes' comedic mockery in the clouds, historians often look at his death as the moment when Athens, wounded by war and self-doubt, turned inward, afraid of its own thinkers. He's a historical figure caught between documentation and dramatization. Socrates wasn't universally loved in his own time. His relentless questioning grated on many, especially those in power. To some Athenians, his death was not a martyr to meet, was a necessary pruning. His accusers, like Miletus, faded into obscurity, remembered only because of the man they helped to kill. That's part of the puzzle why he endures. He's both real and abstract, man and method, skeptic and saint. And while his execution might feel like the tragic silencing of truth, it's not quite so simple. They believed that too much freedom to question, in unstable times, could tear a society apart. The highest price for a principle is the silence it leaves behind. But centuries passed. Philosophers in Rome, clerics in Constantinople, scholars in Parisal read of this man who chose death over compromise. During the Enlightenment, European thinkers resurrected his image as a secular saint of reason, proof that, even long ago, humans could choose logic and virtue over fear. And in modern times, he studied not just for his ideas, but for the power of intellectual disobedience. University students learn to argue, in part because Socrates taught people to doubt. Yet, the deeper you sit with his death, the more difficult the question becomes. Did Socrates die for truth or for stubbornness? Did he refuse to apologize because he believed it was right, or because he couldn't tolerate being wrong? Was his death a grand philosophical stand, or a quiet, unnecessary tragedy? Even his followers wondered. Some believed he could have lived and taught elsewhere. And what of Athens? The city that condemned Socrates would go on to thrive for a time. But the stain remained. In later years, the city came to regret it. Statues were erected. Philosophical schools flourished in his memory. The same democracy that silenced him became the platform from which his ideas spread. Even now, over 2,000 years later, we return to that moment. A prison chamber in the early morning, a simple cup, and a man speaking calmly as death approaches. You wonder what it must have felt like to sit there, to be Credo or Phaedo, watching your mentor die, not with resistance, but with questions. And you wonder, what would you have done? Would you have begged him to escape? Would you have cursed the city? Or would you, like Socrates, have accepted that sometimes? Because here is the real mystery. Socrates' final words. Credo, we owe a rooster to us. Don't forget to pay the debt. Still echo through the ages. Was it a joke, a metaphor, a spiritual offering? Or was it just Socrates being Socrates, slipping one last riddle into the world? Before stepping out of it, you awaken to the echo of horseshoes on snow-covered cobblestone, the faint flicker of gas lamps trembling against the icy wind. The year is 1916. The place, once called St. Petersburg, the glittering heart of Imperial Russia. The empire is cracking, though you wouldn't know it at first glance, from the grand palaces and fur-lined carriages. But there, in the flickering shadows of chandeliers and czarist corridors, walks a figure who doesn't quite belong. He's tall, bearded, wild-eyed, robed in simple cloth, with hands that twitch with both reverence and madness. His name is Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. To some, he's a holy man, divinely touched, mystical, sent to heal the suffering. To others, he is the devil's emissary. And somehow, but all agree on one thing. Rasputin should not be this close to the center of the Russian Empire. And yet, here he is whispering in the ears of Tsars and empresses, dining with dukes, smirking while generals stare, hearing followers, sometimes frightened ones, and rumors swirled of miracles, visions, even he. Empress Alexandra, the boy's mother, was frantic, and within months, he will be dead, weighed down by ceremony hearing of this wild-eyed peasant who claimed to speak with God. Normally, that might have amused them, but this time, they were desperate. His word became sacred to the Empress, who believed he alone could keep her son alive. She called him our friend. Others whispered darker names, not because of what he says, necessarily, but how he says it. He stares too long. He always seems to know what others are thinking, what they fear most. Or so people will say. But the question is, how? He was rumored to have affairs, to extort bribes, to manipulate policy. Whether all of that is true, or merely slander, is still debated. But one fact remained. Rasputin had influence. Rasputin was never meant to matter. He was illiterate, unwashed, and awed even by peasant standards. He saw Rasputin as a threat not just to the Romanovs, but to Russia itself. Alongside other nobles and a conservative politician, he plotted a quiet execution. Not a trial, some desert, perhaps a song, not exile. The name Rasputin itself hints at disorder often misinterpreted as debauched or corrupt. And here, in the center of power, is a mystic with no official title, shaping decisions that affect millions. Something was wrong. How could this man still be alive? In truth, it may have simply meant where two rivers meet. To begin to understand the strange and slow death of Rasputin, you have to go back not just to the palace, but to a cold village in Siberia. Born in 1869 in a remote village of he wandered the countryside as a Stranc, a sort of religious pilgrim, and somewhere in those wanderings, something changed. He began to speak with a force that was hypnotic, but it was not until 1905 that his legend truly began to rise. He collapsed, motionless. You can imagine the imperial court steeped in tradition, because the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, was dying. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a painful genetic condition where even the smallest injury could mean hours of internal bleeding. Doctors were helpless, and so when Rasputin arrived and placed his hands on the boy, and the bleeding slowed, something shifted forever. One account claimed he had water in his lungs, implying he had still been breathing when thrown into the river. Others say that detail was exaggerated. From that moment on, Rasputin was more than a curiosity. He was a fixture. He didn't live in the palace, but he came and went freely. At court, nobles were horrified. He drank to excess. He was crude. And in a nation already on the brink of revolution, that made him dangerous. You sit quietly in a corner of a grand hall, watching Rasputin shuffle past a nervous aide. His presence unsettles everyone. He speaks in riddles. It was this influence, not his fate, that made him a target. But if he were murdered by nobles, the dynasty would fall within 2 years. A misunderstood healer, a man in the wrong place at the worst possible time. By 1916, the war with Germany is going badly. Russian soldiers are dying in thousands. Food is scarce. Morale is shattered. Conspiracy begins to fester like frostbite. And at the heart of it, Prince Felix Yusupov, flamboyant and wealthy, was married to the Tsar's niece. An erasure. What happened next is one of the strangest, most storied death scenes in history. The date, December 30th, 1916. The place, the basement of Yusupov's lavish palace. Rasputin was invited under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's wife. A little wine. What he didn't know was that the wine had been poisoned. The cakes too. Enough cyanide to kill several men. But Rasputin ate and drank and smiled. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Yusupov grew nervous. They panicked. And so, Yusupov retrieved a revolver. In the dim candlelight, Rasputin was shot once in the chest. Relief filled the room. But just as they prepared to dispose of the body, Rasputin's eyes opened. He lunged, fled up the stairs, staggered into the courtyard. Screams echoed through the palace. He was shot again. Twice more. One bullet struck his head. He finally collapsed. This time, they were sure he was dead. To be certain, they tied him up, wrapped him in cloth, and threw him into the frozen Neva River. 3 days later, his body was recovered. Autopsy results were vague, but the myth had already taken root. The man who couldn't be poisoned, who survived gunshots, who tried to rise from death itself. Rasputin was no longer just a mystic. He was a legend. But who was he really? A manipulative fraud. And most hauntingly, did Rasputin truly foresee his death? Because not long before it, he reportedly wrote a letter predicting that if he were killed by commoners, the Romanovs would survive. He was killed by nobles, and less than 2 years later, the Romanovs were executed in a cellar in Siberia. Coincidence? Or something more chilling? The night was meant to be simple, cold, quiet, final. Prince Felix Yusupov had prepared every detail with care. The basement was decorated to look casual, just an informal visit. By then, the city above was asleep beneath layers of frost and moonlight. Only the conspirators remained awake, hearts racing. Wine glasses were set. Small cakes laced with potassium cyanide were arranged on a silver tray, and a phonograph played light music to mask unease. Rasputin arrived just before midnight. Rasputin accepted it, toasting lazily, and drank. Then another, and another. They thought it would be quick. A drink, he laughed. The poison didn't seem to touch him. Smiled. Had the poison failed? Was he immune? Did the chemist botch the dosage? Stroked his beard. The conspirators waited for him to begin coughing, seizing, collapsing. A bite. A death. Instead, it became legend. Silent. One of the other conspirators, Grand Duke, Dmitri, or perhaps Dr. Lazubert, grabbed the pistol and fired again. A second shot missed. A third struck Rasputin in the back. He fell. They had done their duty for Russia, for the throne, for the future. Still, a final shot was fired, point blank, into his forehead. Yusupov greeted Rasputin with a smile and a glass of sweet Madeira, carefully prepared with enough poison to drop an ox, tied it with chains, or ropes accounts. Berian dragged it through the snow to the Neva River. They broke the ice with an iron bar and slid the body into the black water. He chewed on the poisoned pastries as though savoring them. But nothing. He was crawling up the basement stairs, his face pale, his eyes wild, mouth twisted in pain or fury. A coachman reported seeing men carrying a heavy, wrapped bundle late at night. Yusupov later wrote that Rasputin simply leaned back and began to tell stories, rambling tales of mysticism and his adventures. Others said the water in his lungs was a fabrication added to enhance the drama. Hours passed. She had believed Rasputin was divinely chosen to protect her family. When she heard the news, she collapsed in tears and reportedly told the Tsar, "We are lost without him." The autopsy conducted hastily confirmed 3 wounds: chest, back, and forehead. Poison traces were inconclusive. The nobles upstairs grew anxious. In a panic, Yusupov excused himself, went upstairs, and retrieved a revolver. He returned to the basement with shaking hands. A monster. The name alone carried weight charge. With rumor, seduction, mystery. Rasputin stood, perhaps a bit drowsy. Yusupov raised the pistol and fired. The bullet struck Rasputin in the chest. He fell backward. That the river would never freeze the same way again. The others were shuffled to distant assignments. No one was truly held accountable. Relief swept the room like a gust of air. The nightmare was over. They left the body and went upstairs to celebrate. Some champagne, a bit of laughter. But when Yusupov returned downstairs some minutes later, the body was gone. It's hard to imagine the fear that swept over him. Rasputin had gotten up. He pushed open the door, staggered into the snowy courtyard, and began to run. Food lines stretched for blocks. Soldiers, workers struck, and in the chaos of 1917, just months after Rasputin's death, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. Yusupov screamed for help. Still moving, their bodies were dumped in a pit in the woods. They approached him in the snow. Only then did Rasputin stop. The conspirators wrapped his body in cloth. They thought they had erased him, but within a day, the police began investigating. Neighbors had heard the shots. 3 days later, Rasputin's body was found under the ice. Here's where myth overtakes fact. Some claimed his lungs were full of water, suggesting he had still been alive when submerged, that he drowned, not from poison or bullets. His fingers, they said, were bent as though clawing at the ice. His face frozen in agony, his eyes open. Modern historians doubt these details, but the image stuck. Rasputin, the peasant mystic, refused to die until the world had looked into his eyes one last time. The murder was meant to be a political statement, but instead it became an omen. The Empress Alexandra was devastated. Nicholas II, cautious and distant as always, hesitated. He could have punished the conspirators harshly, but he wavered. Prince Yusupov was exiled, but the cracks in the empire widened. Rasputin's death was meant to save the monarchy. Instead, it exposed its fragility. And Rasputin, in death, became something larger than he had ever been in life. A martyr to some. In the streets of Petrograd, peasants murmured that he had cursed the nobles, that his spirit lingered in the palace. There's an eerie symmetry to it all. Rasputin, born in the snow-covered obscurity of Siberia, died in the ice of Russia's capital, surrounded by velvet and mirrors, chandeliers and whispers. He had risen from the margins of society to the core of empire. And even in death, he refused to go quietly. It is said that he once looked a nobleman in the eye and muttered, "You may kill me, but I will not truly die." And in some strange way, that was true. Because a revolution was coming. The war raged on. The Romanovs were arrested, held, shuffled from house to house, and in July 1980, they were murdered in a cellar shot, without ceremony, without trial, just as Rasputin had warned. So you must ask, was his death a triumph of reason over madness, or was it the first domino in the empire's collapse? Could Russia have been saved? The river eventually refroze, hiding any trace of the hole through which Rasputin's body had sunk. The palace windows were cleaned. The basement was cleared. The conspirators returned to their estates. But something had changed. It wasn't just the death of a man. It was the rupture of an illusion idea that the Romanovs, even in their decay, were protected. The gods of dynasty and decorum would shield them forever. Rasputin had been a symptom of that belief, strange, uninvited, but tolerated because he represented hope. And now, even hope was dead. Rasputin's name continued to swirl in the background. In the months that followed, the Russian Empire unraveled with startling speed. The war dragged on, and the cracks turned to chasms. Bread riots erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers disobeyed orders. Workers abandoned factories. The Tsar slowed to respond, clung to a collapsing structure. Some whispered it was because the Empress still heard Rasputin's voice in dreams. In March 1917, the Romanov dynasty, 300 years old, ended with a few strokes of a pen. Nicholas II abdicated. The monarchy dissolved. His only power had been proximity, his whispered conversations with the Empress, his calming presence beside a sickly boy, his unnerving eyes and candlelight. They buried the Romanov, a mystic who defied bullets, a prophet who foresaw the empire's fall. They renamed cities. They silenced mysticism, religion, and aristocracy alike. But Rasputin endured, and yet, even as new political orders formed and the Bolsheviks rose, a wanderer with strange charisma who stumbled into history by luck, by fate, or by sheer mystery. Perhaps his healing of the Tsarevich was real, or perhaps it was coincidence's presence coinciding with natural recovery. You'd think by now he would be forgotten. After all, he held no rank, wrote no doctrine, commanded no army. But Rasputin was not so easily erased. Or perhaps he merely soothed them. The Soviet regime tried. His life became a ghost story, his death a riddle, his legacy a mirror reflecting whatever people needed to see. In Germany, he became a parable for decadence. Was there more than one assassin? In Paris, exiled Russian aristocrats claimed Rasputin had bewitched the Serena, that he had seduced her, that she had betrayed the empire for the love of a holy devil. British newspapers printed sketches of Rasputin as half-wizard. American pulp writers turned his life into romantic melodrama, and in Russia, ironically, the man who had been murdered by monarchists came to be seen by some as a folk hero, a peasant who outwitted nobles. And Rasputin, always the trickster, seems to smile from behind the fog of speculation. But who was Rasputin, really? There's no simple answer. Perhaps he was just a man in the right place at the wrong time. Perhaps he manipulated the Roman. Perhaps he believed in what he said. Or perhaps he didn't. What we know is this. He lived in filth, but walked among royalty. He spoke in riddles, but held influence over war decisions. He had no title, but generals feared him. And when the moment came when the candles burned low, and the cake was eaten, and the gun was raised, he refused to die on time. That resistance to death, that refusal to play his part quietly, turned a backroom murder into myth. Even now, scholars debate the details. Did the poison really fail? Did he actually rise after the gunshot? Was the autopsy The truth is tangled in too many stories. The facts bend around the drama. His story feels like something out of folklore. The man with muddy boots and piercing eyes, who could not be killed until the river swallowed him whole. But the final irony is, perhaps the most haunting of all. Rasputin, for all his flaws, may have understood the Romanovs better than anyone else. He had warned the Tsar perhaps in a letter, perhaps only in speech, that, if he were killed by noble hands, the throne would not survive. And indeed, the nobles pulled the trigger, and the throne was lost. So now, over a century later, you sit by the banks of the frozen Neva and wonder, what was it about this man that terrified an empire? Why did bullets and poison and water all fail to silence him properly? Was Rasputin merely a footnote in the collapse of old Russia, or was he the dark whisper that echoed in its final breath? The battlefield is silent now, save for the distant cry of wounded horses and the slow, aching rustle of banners falling. You are standing in southern Italy, near the ancient city of Assisi. The year is 279 BCE, and there, astride a weary horse, surveying the field with solemn eyes, sits the clash between two powers, Rome and Epirus, has just ended. Soldiers limp through dust-choked air, their armor sticky with sweat and blood. King, warrior, tactician, victor. The silence hangs heavy, because this was a battle won at a price far too high. But he doesn't look victorious. The faces around him do not smile. His generals offer no cheers. This is a moment that will give rise to a phrase we still use today: a Pyrrhic victory. He was said to be a distant relative of Achilles, hero of Troy, and he carried that lineage with pride. But before the phrase, there was the man. Pyrrhus of Epirus was born into a turbulent world. In that chaos, Pyrrhus learned not only how to fight, but how to think like a general. His ambitions, however, were not confined to his father, Eocides, was king of a small kingdom in northwestern Greece. But kingship in ancient Epirus was never guaranteed. It changed with tides of war and favor. When Pyrrhus was only 2 years old, his family was overthrown. His early years were spent in exile, living under the protection of other rulers, learning not just survival, but diplomacy. From childhood, Pyrrhus was surrounded by strategy, by myth, by the weight of heroic legacy. With 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and a startling addition: war elephants. Roma rising, Republic was expanding aggressively, pressing into territories the Greeks had once controlled. Tarentum feared it would be next. The beasts, armored and trumpeting, towered over men and horses alike. It was as though monsters from myths had arrived. He became a soldier early, fighting in the wars of the Diadochi Alexander the Great's successors, who carved the Macedonian Empire into competing fragments. His tactics, honed on the fields of Macedon and Thrace, stunned the Romans. The elephants shattered their formations. Pyrrhus emerged, victorious, and slowly he reclaimed his throne. By the time he was 30, he had established himself as a major power in the Greek world. They reached west to Italy. In 281 BCE, Pyrrhus received a request that would change his life. The Greek city of Tarentum, located in the south of the Italian peninsula, was in crisis. So they called on Pyrrhus, a seasoned general, a descendant of warriors, a king hungry for glory. He answered. The fighting was brutal. Mud, blood, and bodies formed a grim landscape. The elephants were again unleashed. The Romans fought fiercely, but not lightly. He didn't just send an army, he led it himself. Supplies were low. Allies were wavering. Italy was not the welcoming arena Pyrrhus had imagined. This was not just a rescue mission. This was an invasion. You must imagine what it looked like to the Romans who had never seen elephants before. At a cost so steep, it was indistinguishable from defeat. Pyrrhus, ever drawn to heroic ventures, crossed the sea. He won battles, secured cities, and proclaimed himself king of Sicily. And as Carthage regrouped, Pyrrhus realized that he could not hold the island. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BCE, Pyrrhus met the Roman forces head-on, but it wasn't easy. Thousands lay dead on both sides. The Roman losses were great, but so were his own. Still, victory fed his legend. Pyrrhus sent envoys to Rome, expecting peace, but Rome refused. So, Pyrrhus fought again the following year at the Battle of Asculum. He faced the Romans once more. By nightfall, Pyrrhus held the field. It was another victory, but when his men gathered around the campfires, their faces were long. The numbers were thinned. When a companion came to congratulate him, Pyrrhus is said to have replied, "Another such victory, and I am undone." That line, simple, heavy, and exhausted, would live longer than any of his campaigns. A Pyrrhic victory would come to mean winning, but in that moment, Pyrrhus still believed he could outmaneuver fate. He shifted his focus south to Sicily, where Carthage and native forces threatened Greek cities. For a while, he was hailed as a liberator, but soon the tide turned. The Sicilians, tired of his autocratic rule, they had invited a general, not a monarch. His allies dissolved. The cities turned against him. He returned to Italy to find his enemies stronger than before. The Romans had recovered. They had raised new armies, learned from defeat, studied his tactics. Pyrrhus had brought elephants. Rome brought patience. Back in Epirus, his people whispered. The treasury was emptying. His campaigns cost dearly in men and gold. His enemies multiplied faster than he could defeat them. And worst of all, he was alone. Even his victories no longer felt like triumphs. But Pyrrhus, like the heroes he admired, refused to fade quietly. So, you may wonder, what drives a man to keep fighting when victory leaves him weaker than before? Was Pyrrhus addicted to glory? Was he chasing the shadow of Achilles, hoping that by fighting long enough, dying gloriously enough, he too would be immortalized? Or did he simply refuse to accept that a king's reach must sometimes fall short of his ambition? You find yourself once again on a ship, this time crossing the waters of the Mediterranean. The salty wind scratches against the bronze armor of weary soldiers. Not excitement, not hope, just a steady churn of exhaustion. There, King Pyrrhus leans over the railing, his face worn from years of war. Behind him, Italy fades into the mist. Ahead lies Sicilia, new campaign, a new chance. But there's something different in the air now. After the staggering costs of his Italian victories, Pyrrhus turned to Sicily in 278 BCE. What had started as liberation began to feel like occupation. Syracuse named him. Other cities followed suit. Carthaginian forces withdrew temporarily. The war elements, still imposing, marched through Sicilian streets like living gods. Greek cities there, especially Syracuse, had begged him to come. Carthage was encroaching. The local tyrants were unpredictable, and Pyrrhus, always the romantic warrior, saw another stage for glory. He answered the call with the same confidence he'd carried into Italy, and at first, it seemed like the right choice. And unlike Rome, Carthage was a master of the long game. They held their strongholds and bided their time. Upon his arrival, Pyrrhus was welcomed with processions and garlands. He moved quickly, defeating local threats and consolidating his influence. But within months, the pattern began to repeat. Under the command of Consul Manius Curius Dentatus, they stood firm. Where Pyrrhus saw unity, the Sicilian Greeks saw conquest. He restructured governments, imposed new laws, and demanded ships, men, and money. He built a fleet to attack Carthage directly. But delays, revolts, and internal dissent weakened his plans. The Sicilian cities, too, turned cold. His treasury exhausted. His Italian allies had lost faith. He could not win another such victory, not even a draw. There was no glory left in this soil. Pyrrhus once again found himself isolated in a land he had meant to save. The Synod, ever pragmatic, continued to field new legions. The Italian allies who had once wavered now began to see Pyrrhus not as a liberator, but as a lingering invader. And in the end, Pyrrhus returned to where he had begun, home, but changed. Meanwhile, back in Italy, Rome was recovering. The Republic had been bloodied, yes, but not broken. His elephants shocked them, but they learned to counter them. His tactics bested them, but they adjusted. Rome learned. With his usual ambition, He marched into the political chaos of the Hellenic world, capturing cities, deposing rivals, and chasing another crown. Rome adapted, and Rome waited. In 275 BCE, Pyrrhus returned to the mainland. The campaign resumed with one final clash. The Battle of This time, the Romans had seen it all. The elephants, the formations, the maneuvers. The battle was indecisive, perhaps even leaning Roman. But for Pyrrhus, the outcome was undeniable. His army was depleted. He withdrew, back across the sea, back to So, what had it all been for Hannibal, centuries later, would call him the second greatest commander in history, behind only Alexander, not in the blaze of battlefield glory, but in the alleyways of Argos. 6 years of war, thousands of lives lost, kingdoms shaken, fortunes spent. He had marched against the greatest emerging power in the Mediterranean and failed to break it. And yet, he had also taught Rome something it could never forget. Pyrrhus showed them their limits. He exposed the weaknesses in their early armies. He forced them to evolve. In defeating Pyrrhus, Rome became stronger, and in failing to defeat Rome, Pyrrhus sealed his own fate. Back in Epirus, Pyrrhus did not rest. The years had stripped him of moochmen, gold, allies boot night. His appetite for conquest, he turned his gaze to Greece. The Macedonian throne was vacant once more, and he seized the opportunity. The cycle continued. Victory, followed by resistance, followed by collapse. And then, in 272 BCE, came the end. While engaged in a messy street battle inside the city more riot than war, Pyrrhus was struck by a rooftop tile thrown by an old woman watching the fight from above. The tile hit his neck. A Macedonian soldier recognized him and swiftly ended his life with a sword. It was an unceremonious death for a man who had fancied himself the heir of Achilles. A death that felt, to some, less like tragedy and more like exhaustion finally catching up. So here lies the paradox. Pyrrhus was brilliant, charismatic, respected even by his enemies. But what did he build? His victories won him nothing lasting. His wars, though dazzling, drained his people, and his legacy, though filled with tactical genius, carries a name that means winning without winning, a Pyrrhic victory. So you must ask, was Pyrrhus a visionary undone by circumstance, or a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked? Could he have ruled wisely had he ever paused long enough to try? Or was he always chasing battles, not for the results but for the fight itself? The streets of Argos have gone quiet. Dust hangs in the air, stirred by fleeing sandals and the dragging of bodies. No elegy sung, no marble tomb prepared. His body, unceremoniously stripped, was returned to Epirus days later. Among the fallen lies, Pyrrhus of Epirus's armor cracked, his head bloodied from a simple roofing tile hurled by an elderly onlooker. His end, though Vila, lacks the grandeur he might have envisioned. His story would echo quietly but steadily through the corridors of military history, strategy classrooms, and the subtle ironies of empire. It is the 72 BCE, and the man who had crossed seas, battled Rome, and claimed thrones, dies not in a grand final charge, but in the tangled chaos of an alley skirmish. And with that, the story of one of history's most ambitious and ultimately tragic warriors comes to a close. Yet, endings are never quite so simple, because Pyrrhus didn't die only once. A descendant of heroes who fought like one, yet never quite grasped the spoils. A king whose reach often exceeded his grasp. His name would live not in monuments, but in a phrase etched in the languages of law, politics, and war. A Pyrrhic victory, Macedon briefly under his control, passed to Antigonus, too, who would prove more politically adept. The Republic had survived him. More importantly, it had adapted. After Pyrrhus, Rome became sharper, more disciplined, and more determined to dominate, not just defend. The lands he had marched through Italy, Sicily, and southern Greece retreated from memory as other powers rose. It was never a compliment. His invasion served as a trial by fire, a call to arms, a test they were forced to pass. In one famous story, Pyrrhus is approached by an advisor who, after a string of campaigns, asks, "And what then, my king, will you do after conquering all?" But how should we judge him? In life, Pyrrhus was a mosaic of contradiction, a warrior philosopher who read treatises between battles. He was called bold by his admirers and reckless by his critics. And perhaps both were right. After his death, his kingdom of Epirus quickly fractured. His sons quarreled in conquest, in the unfolding of campaigns, the clanging of shields, the weight of maps, and war councils. He was a man born for movement, not stability. Rome, especially, had taken note. Pyrrhus had exposed their vulnerabilities. Yesba, he had also taught them resilience. Some historians have speculated that without Pyrrhus, Rome might not have become the empire it did. And what of the man himself? Ancient writers give us glimpses. Plutarch paints him as generous, brave, and occasionally hot-headed. Pyrrhus smiles and says, "Then we will rest." The advisor pauses. Why not rest now? Political wins that unraveled institutions, technological gains that cost moral clarity, personal triumphs that hollowed out their victors in political debates, in whispered warnings before decisions. It's a haunting question, one that Pyrrhus never truly answered. Or is this just another Pyrrhic victory? Because rest was never his goal. Perhaps, deep down, he understood that his path was unsustainable, that he would never be the next Alexander. Pyrrhus seemed to seek meaning not in rulership, but in motion. And in that constant striving, he left behind a lesson. We live in a world that often glorifies winning at any cost, but Pyrrhus reminds us that not all victories are worth their price. That sometimes, in the glow of achievement, the foundations crack. That gaining ground may mean losing everything else time. People, peace. Consider the phrase, again, a Pyrrhic victory. How many moments in history bear that same shape? Wars that ended in devastation for both sides. Pyrrhus, in losing so much through his wins, gave language to that bitter irony. And so, centuries later, when we speak of him, it's not through statues or songs. It's in courtroom metaphors. Is it worth it? You imagine him now not in battle, but alone, late at night in a royal tent, staring into the flickering flame of an oil lamp. Perhaps he knew that his story would not end with an empire, but with a phrase. And so, we reflect. Was Pyrrhus a tragic hero, undone by ambition? A cautionary tale for those who confuse conquest with meaning? Or simply a man trying, again and again, to matter? And perhaps more importantly, how many of our own victories come at unseen costs? The sun rises over Alexandria, casting a warm glow on its white stone buildings, domed temples, and bustling harbors. The scent of salt and parchment mingles in the air. Among the teachers, scrolls, and diagrams, one voice stands out, calm/clear, confident. You're standing in one of the greatest cities of the ancient world where Egypt, Greece, and Rome have all left their fingerprints. At the heart of this city lies the famed Library of Alexandria. What remains of it in the Museon, a sanctuary for scholars and philosophers. A woman's voice. Her name is She sketches ellipses in the dust with a stylus and challenges her students to reconsider Ptolemaic models of the universe. She stands at the front of a semicircular classroom carved from marble, surrounded by male students. Despite the empire's slow Christianization, the city held remnants of its pagan past temples to schools of Neoplatonism, cults of ancient gods alongside rising bishops. Their robes rustle as they shift to take notes, scratch diagrams onto wax tablets, and lean forward with the kind of awe usually reserved for prophets. She wore the robes of a philosopher, not a wife. Her life was dedicated to study, to teaching, and to the intellectual traditions of Plato and Hypatia. Lectures on geometry, celestial motion, and philosophy. And in Alexandria, one bishop, Cyril, was rising and determined to root out non-Christian influence. His administration leaned toward tolerance as too much for the growing Christian mobs. She is not only the leading mathematician and astronomer of the 4th century CE, and that will be her undoing. But for now, here in this room, she's just a woman sharing the stars. Soldiers patrol, and in corners, zealots whisper, not because she had defied them openly. Power without a pulpit, that she used sorcery. That she bewitched Oreste. That her instruments were unholy tools. That she plotted against the church. A woman leading men, teaching science. When many wanted scripture, they speak of purity, of heresy, of cleansing the city of those who defy the word. Respected by the Roman governor and known to advise him, became a lightning rod. No trial, no arrests. He taught her the classical curriculum. Arithmetic, astronomy, music, geometry, logic, but she surpassed even his high expectations. Hypatia was born around 355 CE, the daughter of Theon himself, a renowned mathematician and philosopher, tore her flesh and burned the remains. Alexandria, under Roman rule, was still a cosmopolitan center of knowledge. Hypatia chose not to marry. They were men fueled by fire, led by a lector named Peter. She wrote commentaries on diaphanuses, improved the design of astrolabes, and reportedly invented devices for measuring the density of liquids hydrometers through the streets into a church. But Hypatia's true power wasn't just in math, it was in influence. In Alexandria, politics and religion weren't separates. They were braided together like ropes under tension. By the early 400s CE, the Roman Empire was officially Christian. Pagan temples were being closed. Bishops held more authority than governors. At the same time, the city's Roman governor Orestes was struggling to maintain balance between the diverse populations: pagans, Jews, Christians, philosophers. Hypatia found herself caught in the middle. You must imagine the streets of Alexandria at this time, colorful, chaotic, full of tension. The agora buzzes with gossip. Priests call for prayers, and they whisper the name, not because she was unholy, but because she represented knowledge without doctrine. The wedge was driven deeper by the rivalry between Orestes and Bishop Cyril. Rumors spread. The line between myth and fear, between learning and heresy, began to blur. And once those lines blur, mobs form. One day, as Hypatia rode her chariots, as she often did, she was intercepted by a Christian mob. These were not theologians or bishops. They dragged her from the chariot, there, in the dim shadows of icons and altar smoke. History tells us they stripped her, beat her with roof tiles or oyster shells. She was over 60 years old. The brutality was shocking even to her enemies. Some Christians denounced the act, but no justice followed. Her death marked more than the end of a life. It was the extinguishing of a certain kind of world, the last of the classical philosophers, the last light of Alexandria's scientific legacy, a symbol of open inquiry. Gone. So now, centuries later, we ask, was Hypatia killed because of what she believed? Or because she refused to kneel? Did her intellect threaten the church, or simply remind them of what they couldn't control? And what does it mean, even today, to live in a world where knowledge becomes dangerous? The city of Alexandria never really slept, even as darkness crept across its rooftops and wind rippled the robes of statues. Someone was always walking, arguing, debating, praying, watching, of ideas rubbing against power, of old gods facing new faiths. Her students came from across the Empire, Syria, Anatolia. They were pagans, Christians, even a few Jews. She taught not dogma, but drawn from Plato's ideas, but filtered through centuries of spiritual contemplation. In the flickering lamplight of narrow streets and smoky courtyards, something always stirred, of harmony, geometry, and the music of the spheres. It was a city of edges, over taxes. She wasn't known for fiery speeches or play. In the Roman tradition, occupying public space without apology. She advised the governor resisting the bishop's influence. She taught a view of the cosmos that did not begin with Genesis, but in a city where symbols mattered more than words. Her presence became a political statement over the authority of church versus state, over mobs in the streets, and, increasingly, over war. The unadorned robes of a philosopher, refused to marry, rejected political office, and yet she moved in political circles with ease. Roman governors men like Orestes sought her counsel. She wrote letters to civic leaders. Her advice, often gentle, was respected, and she stood at the sharpest edge of all. In the years before her death, Hypatia's reputation had only grown. She spoke of the one, the unchanging source of all existence, beyond language and reason, of the soul's ascent through wisdom. Hypatia, who had always advocated tolerance, reportedly opposed this move. Born to a powerful Christian family, Cyril was smart, disciplined, and fiercely devoted to shaping Alexandria into a bastion of orthodoxy. Under his leadership, the church began asserting authority not just in spiritual matters, but civic ones as well. To her students, she was not just a mathematician. She was a moral compass. She held herself with simplicity. There, beneath the painted icons, they tore her to pieces. But not everyone saw her influence as spied on, watched as she made her daily ride through the city, always alone, always exposed. The Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, had his own vision of the city. He was a cleric, part of the church's lower ranks. Others suggested it was the chaos of a mob, not the will of the bishop. Cyril himself was never formally charged, but the shadow of the killing followed him. But he wielded considerable influence over the more radical Christian factions. He and his followers, the church, though stained by the act, emerged stronger than ever. The last remnants of Alexandria's pagan intellectual tradition were scattered. Some students fled to Athens, others simply vanished, enraged by what they saw as Hypatia's defiance of divine order, plotted her removal. Others claim it was scattered to prevent a burial. One of his first major acts was to expel the city's large Jewish population after a series of violent clashes. Soon after, tensions deepened between Cyril and the Roman governor. The two leaders clashed frequently. There's little evidence that Hypatia openly challenged the church. She was a pagan philosopher. In quieter times, this might have passed. But Alexandria in 414 CE was not quiet. One day, Orestes was attacked in the streets by a group of Christian monks. Though he survived, the incident shocked the city, arguing Plato with students under a When Cyril refused to hand over the attackers, the divide between church and governor widened. The public began choosing sides, and in the background, always visible always, just thought, precision, beauty. Whispers began that she controlled Orestes, that her pagan spells kept him from baptizing, that she used her scrolls like sorcery, that she was the real source of the city's division. We know these accusations were not spontaneous. They were deliberate, political, a slow poisoning of public perception. And then, one day, the crowd acted. Peter the Reader was not a bishop, nor even a priest. She was followed. And when the moment came, they pulled her from her chariot, dragged her through the streets, into a church. It's hard to know exactly how much of the grisly detail is true. Some accounts say they used broken roof tiles to slice her skin. Others mention oyster shells. Some say they burned her body in the streets. But all agree it was brutal, public-final, a scholar's death, meted out like a heretic's. After her murder, the city recoiled. Even Christian writers struggled to justify the act. Some blamed Peter directly. Orestes, shaken and politically wounded, soon left Alexandria. Cyril's power grew, and the Neoplatonic school collapsed. A chapter had ended. So what do we take from this? Was Hypatia killed because of her paganism, her philosophy, her political ties, or was it all of it rolled into one unbearable symbol? A woman, wise and respected, standing in defiance of the narrow definitions being drawn around truth. You picture her, now not at her death, but in her element, sketching a circle, calculating the movements of Venus. There is no mob here, and you wonder, in the days following Hypatia's murder, Alexandria felt quieter not from mourning, but from a kind of spiritual concussion. The energy that once animated its academic halls, bustling debates, and mingling of beliefs had been forcibly drained. Streets once filled with scholars and scribes were now dominated by church processions, patrolling guards, and whispers. It wasn't just a woman who had died. It was a cultural way of living that honored questions more than answers. To understand what her death truly meant, you must step back and look at Alexandria as it had once been, founded by Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BC, Alexandria had grown into one of the most remarkable intellectual cities in human history. It was the home of the Great Library, which at its height may have held over 400,000 scrolls texts on astronomy, was one of the last threads connecting that ancient golden age to the collapsing world around her. Medicine, mathematics, poetry, geography, and philosophy from every corner of the known world. The city's scholars once studied the circumference of the earth, the path of the stars, the mechanics of pulleys and levers. The idea of women as public intellectuals, teachers, and civic figures would be pushed into the margins. The causes of disease. And Hypatia, centuries later, she taught Plato, not Poseidon. She didn't call for temples to be rebuilt. She wasn't organizing resistance. She was not a remnant. She was a torchbearer to a world where only one truth, tightly controlled, was allowed. But with her gone, that torch flickered dangerously low. There were symbols. They suggested that the universe could be understood, measured, examined, comprehended without needing to invoke divine intervention at every step. After her death, no women would rise to her prominence in the philosophical schools for more than 1,000 years. Renaissance scholars, especially those drawn to Neoplatonism, began to rediscover her, portraying her as a symbol of wisdom lost. Even more troubling was the message Alexandria received. That opening quairef, it conflicted with power, was no longer safe. This wasn't merely the victory of one religious ideology over another. It was a transition from a world where multiple truths could be explored. Ironically, Hypatia was not opposed to Christianity. Others focused on her intellect. Still others used her story to criticize organized religion and its historical abuses. She had students who were Christian, but she represented an alternate authority, not one drawn from scripture, one drawn from geometry. Consider the instruments she left behind. Astrolabe used to measure stars, hydrometers used to calculate density, or her notes on Diophantus resting on a desk she would never return to. Ink still wet, equations half finished, a question scratched into the margin, compasses and protractors used to trace the movements of heavenly bodies, in the hum of telescopes searching for stars, in the slow unfolding of an equation that reveals not a god, but gravity. These weren't just tools, and that terrified some people. Over the centuries, Hypatia's story was written in every student who learns that the universe has structure. In every moment when knowledge quiet, deliberate knowledge refuses to bow. The medieval Christian writers often ignored her or dismissed her as a footnote. By the Enlightenment, she was hailed as a martyr to reason. In the 18th and 19th centuries, her life became a subject of novels, essays, and operas. Some exaggerated her beauty. Each version added a layer to the legend. But somewhere beneath all the projections was a real woman. One who woke early to teach, who read by candlelight, who argued with confidence in rooms filled with men, who refused to step aside. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what lingers. Not just what she thought, but how she lived. Without apology, without fear, without compromise. Her enemies called her dangerous, not because of what she believed, but because she believed it openly and refused to hide. You imagine the last scrolls of her commentary on conic sections, unanswered, like so many questions lost that day. But what survives is not just tragedy. Hypatia's legacy is echoed in every woman who steps into a classroom and teaches. She is in the whisper of chalk on a blackboard. So we are left to wonder, what kind of world might we have had if Hypatia had lived? If Alexandria had chosen reason over rage? If scrolls had not burned, but been And how many times in our own history have we silenced brilliance before we ever understood it? The desert wind stirs the canvas flaps of the imperial tent. Outside, a crimson sun sets over the Mesopotamian plains, casting long shadows across the Roman encampment. He flips through a worn copy of Plato's Republic, annotated in the margins with his own thoughts. Spears glint in the fading light, and the murmurs of soldiers drift like dust between banners. Inside the tent, seated on a stool, dressed in a simple tunic, is not a hardened general or a cunning bureaucrat but a scholar. This is Julian, Emperor of Rome, philosopher, warrior, dreamer, nephew to Constantine, the great emperor who famously converted to Christianity and gave legal status to the faith. Julian's father and brother were both murdered in palace intrigues. Julian survived, but barely, exiled to the safety of study, raised far from court in Nicomedia and later, and soon, a corpse. He was trained in rhetoric, Greek, and Latin. He read Homer, Plato, and Epic. He learned about the old god Zeus Apollo and Dionysus, not as religion, but as high thought. Julian was born in 331 CE into the glittering but perilous world of the Constantinian dynasty. After Constantine's death, a violent purge swept the imperial family. There, surrounded by scrolls rather than swords, Julian immersed himself in classical philosophy, while the empire embraced Christianity. With fervor, Julian quietly cultivated a love for pagan antiquity. The Emperor Constantius, the second Julian's cousin, was desperate for loyal men to hold the front. His life might have ended in obscurity, a bookish relic of a fading tradition. But fate intervened. The soldiers refused. They proclaimed Julian Augustus full emperor. By the mid-350s, the empire was divided and unstable. Civil wars flared. Frontier threats multiplied. Against all expectations, Julian was summoned to leadership. At first, he was given the rank of Caesar Jr. Emperor and sent to Gaul to handle barbarian incursions. Everyone expected him to fail. He knew the doctrines, the bishops, and the rituals. Julian surprised everyone. The quiet reverence of temples lit with oil lamps and filled with the scent of myrrh. Though inexperienced in war, he proved to be a skilled strategist. He led Roman legions to victory against Germanic tribes, restored order to frontier cities, and won the loyalty of his men through modesty and courage. He called himself Pontifex, Maximus High Priest of the old religion, and led sacrifices in person, draped in traditional robes. He ate with his soldiers, marched with them, and slept in tents rather than palaces. His victories made him popular. Too popular. He corresponded with philosophers, urging them to return to public life. Statues of Apollo and Athena are dusted off and given garlands. Philosophers speak in public squares, but churches remain open to. Bishops still preach. Christian hymns still echo. Constantius, wary of Julian's growing fame, ordered several legions to be transferred east. A civil war seemed inevitable. But fate intervened again. Constantius died of fever in 361 CE. Julian, now 30 years old, marched into Constantinople not as a usurper, but as the undisputed ruler of the Roman world. He dreams of glory, of uniting the East under a banner of restored Roman virtue and pagan wisdom. What came next was one of the most fascinating and short-lived experiments in Roman history. The Persians refused a pitched battle, retreating in scorching fields. Julian had been raised in a Christian empire, but in his heart, he believed in something else. He believed in the ancient gods, the Olympians, the sacred rites of the cosmic harmony described by Plato. And so, as emperor, he attempted the impossible. To turn back the clock, he reintroduced state support for pagan cults. He reopened temples that had been closed. He banned Christian educators from teaching classical texts. His breath grows shallow. He wrote treatises defending Hellenic worship. He founded schools to promote He tried not to persecute Christians. Directly, he saw himself as a man of principle, not vengeance, but his policies clearly sought to sideline them. To some, he was Julian the philosopher. To others, He became Julian the Apostata, one who betrayed the new faith. You walk through the streets of Constantinople in those years and feel the tension. Temples bustle with activity again. No wife, no child, no named successor. Julian's Rome is not unified. It is divided deeply, and though he is sincere in his beliefs, he is ruling with a backward gaze, trying to resurrect a culture already in decline. Still, for a time, it seems possible, until Persia calls. In 363 CE, Julian embarks on a bold campaign deep into Sassanid Persian territory. He seeks to emulate Alexander the Great, marching swiftly, decisively, and capturing the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. But the campaign is rushed, supplies run low. Julian presses forward anyway. And then, in a moment of chaos outside Samarra, everything changes. During a minor skirmish, Julian, fitting without armorides, into the fray. A spear pierces his abdomen. He falls from his horse, clutching his side, blood soaking the soil. His guards carry him to camp. He refuses to be moved further. Fever grips him. He cannot speak. Some say he tried to tear the spear from his belly and finish the battle anyway. Others say he looked to the sky and whispered, "You have won, Galilean," addressing Christ in final, bitter surrender. But did he really say that? Or is it just another invention, another piece of narrative crafted by victors? What is certain is that Julian died the next day, only 31 years old, or a man hopelessly out of step with his time. With him died the last real chance of restoring paganism as Rome's dominant religion. So you must ask, was Julian brave or foolish? A philosopher trying to lead an empire, or a ruler trying to reanimate a corpse? Was he a tragic visionary? The sand of Mesopotamia soaks up blood quickly. By the time the sun returns to the Roman camp, Emperor Julian lies still, wrapped in linen and imperial purple, his breath long gone. Around him, generals argue in hushed tones. He was something else entirely, perhaps, the strangest man to ever sit upon Rome's throne. The army is leaderless. The ashes were placed in a golden urn and transported back west, eventually laid to rest in Tarsus. No triumphal arch, no grand basilica, just quiet disposal of a complicated legacy, eloquent, sarcastic. Their campaign is failing, and yet, in that short time, he stirred up centuries of tension between old and new, myth and doctrine, and freedom and order. Their philosopherking is dead, but far beyond the battlefield. In temples, churches, academies, and villas, the world begins to reckon with what his death really means. Because Julian wasn't just another emperor, his body was burned, according to pagan rites. Julian ruled for less than 2 years as sole emperor. He saw the old pantheon diverse, symbolic, open to interpretation as more compatible with human dignity. In his writings, which survive in surprising quantity, we glimpse a mind at war with the times. The memory of his reforms fades like chalk on a damp wall. He was brilliant. His letters scolded governors for laziness, mocked courtiers for their hypocrisy, and pleaded with philosophers to embrace public duty. He wrote with the frustration of a man who saw his world slipping away and tried desperately to gather its fragments. One of his most famous works, Against the Galileans, was a full-throated critique of Christianity, not because he hated Christ, necessarily, but because he believed the new religion had amputated the Roman soul. He thought Christianity too narrow, too obsessed with sin and salvation, and too dismissive of beauty and reason. He mocked the idea of one jealous God. Julian didn't just miss the old religion, he believed it could save Rome from decline. But as he found, belief alone is not enough. You walk through Constantinople a year after his death, and already the tide has turned. His boldness had echoes of Alexander Butna. The same results. Temples that reopened under Julian now sit empty again. Christian bishops, once wary, return with renewed confidence. Edicts are reversed. Teachers loyal to Julian's cause are dismissed. After Julian's death, the Roman army was forced to retreat and sue for peace, ceding land in the process. His successor, Jovian, a Christian general, immediately declares religious tolerance but restores Christianity as the favored state religion. Julian's writings are quietly buried in monastic shelves, copied with caution, and remembered mostly as the scribblings of a heretic. And yet, he would not vanish entirely. In the centuries to come, Neoplatonists would quote him with reverence. Byzantine thinkers would puzzle over his critiques. Enlightenment philosophers disillusioned by dogma would rediscover his voice. Voltaire admired him. It was deeply rooted in the empire's legal, cultural, and social structures. Bishops held political sway. Christian charity networks outpaced imperial institutions. To them, Julian was not a failure, but a flickering candle proof that even in the darkest of times, reason had not entirely died. But what did his soldiers think as they carried his body across the desert? Was he, to them, a hero, or just a man who led them too far, too fast? He had campaigned recklessly, deep in enemy territory, far from supply lines. A candle flickers beside scrolls, his armor resting on a wooden rack. He is not praying to a saint, but contemplating the stars, calculating, perhaps, the geometry of heaven. The Persian campaign was, in many ways, a disaster. Even his final war left more scars than victories. Still, it's tempting to imagine what might have been. What if Julian had lived? What if he had returned from Persia triumphant, with cities won and temples restored? Could he have sustained a pagan revival, or was the world already too far gone? Christianity, by Julian's time, was no longer an upstart sect. Julian may have worn the laurel wreath of empire, but his gods had lost their throne long before he ever sat on his. And yet, there's something undeniably noble about his efforts. He did not persecute Christians with the same brutality they had once endured. He tried persuasion, he argued with logic, not legions. He did not want blood. He wanted a debate. You picture him again, in his tent, the night before his final battle. There's something tragic in that image, but also something deeply Roman. Julian did not belong in his century. He belonged to a time of Socratic dialogues, of academy steps, of oracles and symposia, and in a world growing louder, with chants of Dominus Deus, he still whispered in Greek. So we are left with a question. Was Julian's failure inevitable? Or was he simply ahead of his time, in the wrong time? And how often in history have the right ideas, beauty, reason lost to the thunder of progress, marching in another direction, in the long twilight of the Roman Empire? Julian's story flickers like a candle struggling against the wind, not bright enough to change history, not dim enough to be forgotten. His life brief, brilliant, and burdened with contradiction stands as a final chapter in a fading book. Rome would go on, of course. Its eastern half, what we call the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly another 1,000 years. But the world Julian longed for, the world of Plato and oracles, of marble temples and mystery rites, was over. And somewhere, deep down, Julian likely knew that. Even during his reign, Julian's reforms met resistance, not just from Christians, but from the pagans he sought to restore. Where Julian saw beauty and myth, many now saw superstition. Where he saw reverent polytheism, others saw chaos and contradiction. The temples he reopened were often empty. The priesthoods he revived lacked energy. Sacrifices resumed, but the crowds were thin. People had moved on. The spiritual imagination of the empire had changed. And where he hoped to build a new philosophical religion, grounded in Neoplatonism and traditional cults, he instead uncovered only the ruins of a system that had no breath left. But Julian's legacy doesn't lie in legislation or in temples. It lies in the attempt, not by torching churches, but by opening books, not by purging bishops, but by restoring altars. He remains the last Roman emperor to actively, openly resist the Christianization of Rome. They called him Julian, the apostate, a title that stuck like apostate. Not just one who disbelieves, but one who turns his back on truth. He tried to reconstruct a Roman soul made up of Plato's logic, Homer's glory, and the gods of in a way, he was Rome's final question mark. A bird nests in what was once the altar to Apollo. After his death, Christian historians got the last word. They wrote of his arrogance, his heresies. Some claimed his death was divine punishment, God's wrath, for daring to challenge the church. But others remembered differently. To the pagan philosophers of Athens, Julian was a martyr to wisdom. To scholars centuries later, he was a tragic symbol like Hypatia, like Socrates of reason, silenced by the march of dogma. Even to his enemies, Julian's intellect was undeniable. He was a writer, not just a ruler, a thinker, not just a fighter. He authored philosophical dialogues, hymns to the gods, and biting satires against corruption. And though it failed, it left an imprint. You walk the ruins of a temple Julian once restored. The columns are weathered and the roof collapsed. Grass sprouts between the stones. When Enlightenment philosophers questioned dogma and demanded reason, Julian's lonely voice echoed faintly behind them. It is quiet, and yet you imagine him robes fluttering, arms outstretched, chanting a hymn to the sun, not as a relic, but as a believer. One of the last, in one of his final surviving letters, Julian wrote, "I do not wish to be remembered for wars or laws, but for having rekindled the fire of the muses in a world going dark." It was not a boast. It was a hope that somewhere, someone would pick up that spark and carry it forward. That trying to preserve something, even if it cannot be saved, is still an act of meaning. And perhaps that hope wasn't in vain. Because centuries later, when Renaissance scholars dusted off Plato's Timaeus or rebuilt Euclid's theorems, they found Julian's ghost there in the margins. He didn't change the course of Rome, but he may have nudged the future just slightly. Still, his life forces uncomfortable questions. What do we owe the past? Can beauty and belief coexist in the modern world? And what is lost when civilizations move forward by forgetting what came before? Julian's story is a reminder that not every defeat is disgraceful. He tried to resurrect a world, not with fire, but with thought. And when the world didn't follow, he walked into the desert anyway. So now we ask, as the sun sets over Julian's dusty tomb, was he a hero of philosophy, or just a man chasing shadows? And when reason walks into battle with faith, can it ever truly win? It is the morning of October 14th, 1066. The sun has barely crested the horizon over Sussex. Mist clings to the heather. King for only 9 months, warrior for a lifetime. A hush falls across a ridge near the town of Hastings-Sinelac Hill, as it will one day be known. Below, rows of Norman cavalry shift in anticipation. Above, behind a wall of shields, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England stands. He was a trusted advisor, a skilled diplomat, and a respected commander. As England's leading earl, he controlled vast lands and held sway over the nobility. His name is Harold. Harold was a son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful noblemen in Anglo-Saxon England, but not of royal blood. His rise came not through divine right, but through cunning, charisma, and sheer in mere hours, his reign ended. The history of his entire people will meet its brutal end. Edward's half Norman. Relatives whispered of Duke William of Normandy. Others pushed for Theling claimants or Scandinavian princes. And yet, he stands unflinching, because Harold, more than anything, was a man who understood the weight of the moment. He hadn't been born to wear a crown. By the mid-11th century, Harold had proven himself indispensable to King Edward the Viking threat was ended in a single, bloody day. But Edward was childless, and as the king aged, the question of succession loomed large. Different factions had their own candidates, but Harold, present, popular, powerful, was a man of the realm, a man of action. William's claim to the throne rested on a murky promise. Some said King Edward had named him heir years earlier. Others claimed Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim during a trip to Normandy. And when Edward died in January 1066, Harold was crowned king. He was forced to march north to repel an invasion by Harald Hardrada of Norway, one of the most feared warriors of the age. Still, He moved quickly, determined to repel the second invasion just as he had the first. Behind them stood ranks of firemen, farmers and freemen called up to fight. Hardrada had allied with Harold's own brother, who sought revenge after being ousted as Earl of North. Some said it was the will of the wit in the Council of Nobles. Others said it was a youth across the Channel. William of Normandy called it treason. The crown sat heavy on Harold's head from the moment it touched his brow. He was not some distant noble, he was one of them. Barely months into his reign, in late September, Harold led his army from London to Stamford Bridge, nearly 200 miles away. The march was punishing, fast, desperate. Each time the English broke ranks, the Normans exploited the gap. The shield wall weakened, the line thinned. Their cavalry thundered uphill, only to be driven back by the impenetrable English shield wall. English troops, believing the enemy to be in full retreat, broke ranks and pursued them down the hill. But it worked. But the Duke lifted his helmet, showed his face, and rallied his troops. Harold crushed the Norwegians in a surprise attack. Hardrada was killed. So was Tostig. And then, word came from the south. William had landed. The Normans had crossed the Channel with a massive fleet bird. Half 700 ships and landed at Whatever the truth, William's ambition was clear. Whether by accident or deliberate insult, it took days to identify his remains. Some say it was his mistress, Edith Swanwick, who recognized him by marks only. She knew he wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to conquer. Harold turned south again, his army exhausted from the march and battle in the north. By October 13th, he arrived near Hastings and established a defensive position on high ground. His housecarls' elite axemen formed the core of his shield wall. The English were outnumbered, but they held the advantage of terrain. More importantly, they believed in their king. Harold had fought beside them. He had led them to victory. On the morning of the 14th, the Normans advanced. They came in 3 divisions. Bretons on the left, French in the center, and Flemings on the right. Wave after wave, they attacked, and wave after wave, they were repelled. At one point, the Norman line nearly collapsed. Rumors spread that William had been killed. Then came the turning point, a feigned retreat. Whether by accident or design, a group of Norman cavalry turned and fled. William's men wheeled around and cut him down. The pattern repeated, and again, and as the day wore on, the weight of exhaustion, poor coordination, and relentless assault took its toll. Near dusk, the final blow came. Accounts vary. Some say it was a spear, others say an arrow, but legend insists that Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king, was struck in the eye. Hefo, his personal guard, fought to the death around his body. But with the king gone, the defense crumbled. The Normans overran the hill. By nightfall, the English army was shattered. The road to London lay open. Harold's body was mutilated in the aftermath. His brothers Gurth and Lethwin also died that day. So did the age of Anglo-Saxon England. In the cathedral William later built on the site of the battle, Abbey he ordered that the high altar be placed where Harold had fallen. It was more than a burial. It was a statement. But what did Harold's death really signify? Was it the fall of a usurper or the end of a people's way of life? Was it inevitable that England would be conquered, or was Harold's death a twist of fate? What if that arrow had missed? What if the shield wall had held just a little longer? Night falls over Sinlac Hill, and the battlefield is quiet at last. The sounds of sword clashing on shields, of men shouting their final breath, have faded. Only the crows remain now, circling overhead, and at the center of it all lies the shattered body of King Harold. They do not yet know what they've lost. Harold's army had been the best England could field, and it was now broken. His brothers were dead, his loyal housecarls wiped out. London, though still holding firm, was leaderless. Whether struck by arrow, blade, or fate itself, he will never rise again. The air smells of iron and damp earth, but communal. The king was elected by the Witan, the council of nobles and clergy. He led his people, fought for them, and ruled alongside them. The Normans move among the fallen, scavenging weapons and valuables, lighting torches to illuminate the grisly remains. A few miles away, the people of southern England wait. They know a battle has been fought. Bishops and nobles, seeing the inevitability of his rise, began to switch allegiance in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings. There was confusion, chaos. Even when the Normans heard the crowd shouting in English for the new king, they thought it was a revolt. They set fire to nearby buildings. The abbey filled with smoke. But it was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual one. Some say she begged for its return. Others claim the body was buried in secret, at sea or at Waltham Abbey, where Harold had once knelt in prayer. For decades, the Anglo-Saxon identity had been shaped around its kingship. Not divine, like in continental monarchies. Harold was the last of those kings. She vanished from the record. Like so many women in history, remembered only through sorrow. Not born of royal blood, but chosen by acclaim, crowned in Westminster. Valiant in war, fallible, perhaps but familiar. Resistance flared in the north and west. Rebellions in York were met with scorched earth reprisals. Villagers were burned, fields salted, livestock slaughtered. The customs of the countryside persisted, stubborn in their rhythm. The stories of Harold lived on first, whispered, then recorded in monastic texts and folk songs, and a different idea of kingship, one rooted in divine right, not communal election. And now he was gone, a silence that hides the screams. Once heard here, endures in the famous B.R. Tapestria, winding embroidery of conquest, commissioned by the Normans themselves. One figure, anonymous, but centrally placed, is shown with an arrow to the face, and the words "Harold is killed." William did not immediately become king upon Harold's death. Though victorious, he still had to fight for every inch of legitimacy. But Edgar was only a boy, and the nobility fractured. Some favored surrender. Others held out hope for resistance. London prepared for siege. The wit and what remained of it briefly declared Edgar Theling, a young grandson of Edmund Ironside. Their language was pushed aside. Their traditions the end of a native nobility. The end of a language untainted by foreign rule. William advanced cautiously. He marched toward London, ravaging the countryside to demonstrate power. Towns surrendered to avoid destruction. By Christmas of 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, same place where Harold had stood less than a year before. But the ceremony was marred by confusion. It was not a beginning. It was an omen. And what of Harold's family? His mother, Geetha, refused to surrender his body to the Normans. Even when William was offered its weight in gold, his sons fled first to Ireland, then to Wales, but never regained power. Edith Swanwick, his beloved companion of many years, was never officially recognized as queen. What followed was not immediate peace. The Norman conquest continued, brutal, relentless. The harrying of the north killed tens of thousands. Winter and starvation finished the rest. Within a decade, the Anglo-Saxon nobility had been nearly wiped out or exiled. Their lands were seized, redistributed to Norman barons. A new elite had taken power, and they brought with them a foreign language, feudal law. Still, echoes of the old world lingered. The English tongue survived, though reshaped by French. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, once a royal record, began to take on the tone of mourning. Entries after 1066 grow sparse, bitter. One reads, "Then came William, and he harried the people, and they said it was a great sorrow that such a king was slain. You stand now on the battlefield, nearly 1,000 years later. A grassy slope, a memorial stone. The arrow in thy story, perhaps apocryphal. Was it propaganda, a poetic flourish, or truth? We may never know. But the image endures, because Harold's death is not just a moment in a war, it is the death of a world. The end of the old English kingship. After 1066, England was never the same. Its laws, land, lords, and language changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes savagely, and it all began with a man who held a hill until he couldn't. So we asked, was Harold a hero, doing his duty against impossible odds? Or was he a man undone by ambition and miscalculation? Had he lived, Could England have resisted Norman influence? Or did the arrow simply mark the inevitable? And when a culture dies, how long does its echo remain? Long after the bodies had been buried, those of Harold, his brothers, his housecarls, and thousands of unnamed men. The winds over Senlac Hill still blew cold. Sheep now grazed where warriors had fallen. The grass grew thick and indifferent over the scars of conquest. But though the landscape healed, England itself had changed. The death of King Harold at Hastings wasn't just a change of monarch. It was the final, irreversible step into a new world, and it was quieter than expected. No great cataclysm, no firestorms or sieges in every town, just a steady, deliberate shifting of power, of names, of law, of language, and in time, of memory. After the battle, after the coronation, William the Conqueror spent years consolidating his grip. Rebellions rose and were crushed. Castles were built in stone. A new hierarchy descended upon the land. Written not in custom, but in conquest, he became a symbol of resistance, of a time before the Normans, before foreign lords and foreign tongues. A line-by-line account of what the Normans had gained and the Anglo-Saxons had lost. In 1086, 20 years after Hastings, the Doomsday Book was compiled. A vast census of land, property, and power. Gone. His family's name omitted. The old nobles. Scholars debate whether the arrow was added later, whether it was symbolic, displaced, diminished, or executed. That, he repented, prayed, and lived to old age in anonymity. Harold's lands, of the roughly 180 tenants-in-chief in Doomsday, fewer than 5 were of English descent, but Harold lived there not in law or title, but in story. The legal system changed. 2 feudal obligations replaced older tribal structures. Royal power became more centralized, modeled on the continental monarchy. The Witan faded, but Parliament would one day rise in its place. Among the English commoners, his memory grew into something mythic. He was remembered as brave, just, loyal. In some versions, the arrow never struck. There were rumors, almost certainly false, that Harold survived Hastings, that he wandered the earth as a blind hermit. Why did such stories spread? Because a man like Harold, people believed, should not have died that way. 9 months, 1 coronation, 2 major battles, 1 death. Even those who called themselves English bore names and blood from Normandy, because when a people lose their leader in their land, they reach for stories to fill the silence. The Bayard Tapestry, stitched by Norman hands, is one of the only contemporary accounts of Harold's death. It is art, yes, but also propaganda. Painters depicted him valiantly, holding his shield against Norman cavalry. Writers mourned his fall as the end of a pure English identity, and his rapid coronation after Edward's death was controversial. It tells us more about how the victors wanted to be seen than what actually happened. Harold is shown twice in the final panels, once struck by an arrow in the eye, once cut down by a sword. In medieval iconography, an arrow to the eye represented divine punishment for oath-breaking. To remember, to the Normans, Harold had broken a sacred vow to support William. To the English, he had simply defended his birthright. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the grass. The cultural transformation of England after 1066 was slow, but deep. Is it the end of a reign or the beginning of a myth? Anglo-Saxon was no longer the language of power. Latin and Norman French filled the courts over generations. The languages blended. But even so, pieces of Harold's world remained. The shires and hundreds still shaped administrative boundaries. The church, deeply rooted in English life, was restructured, but not erased. And the people, though often, for historians, Harold's reign is short and tragic. But for poets and chroniclers, he became more than a king. He became the last true English king, not just because of his bloodline, but because of what followed. After Harold, there was never again a native English monarch until centuries later. Harold was the last link to a time before the island bent to foreign crowns. In the 19th century, during the rise of nationalism, Harold's legend surged again, but reality was more complex. Harold was not perfect. His claim to the throne was debated. Still, in his courage, his leadership, and his death, he became a mirror, a figure people could project their hopes and grief onto. You walk the grounds of Waltham Abbey today, where tradition claims Harold was buried. It is quiet. A single stone marks the supposed spot. The inscription reads, "Here lies Harold, King of the English Lane at Hastings." But no one knows if he's truly buried there. Perhaps he is. Perhaps not. What matters more is that people come still to stand there, to wonder. Because Harold's death raises questions that linger far beyond one battle. How do nations lose themselves? How do people remember what they no longer possess? And when a man dies with a crown on his head and an arrow in his eye, it's a cool October evening in Prague, 1601. Candles flicker in tall glass holders. The scent of wine, sweat, and roast fowl hangs in the air. You're standing in the hall of a noble estate, where scholars, courtiers, and dignitaries mingle in silks and velvet. Among them walks a man of unmistakable presence. He is tall, slightly stooped, with a long reddish beard and piercing eyes. His clothes are richly embroidered, yet odd in cut. His nose strikingly artificial gleams, with a dull golden shine. This is Tycho Brahe, the man who mapped the stars before telescopes. Who changed the universe before dying? Quite literally, because of bad manners. To understand Tycho, you must first set aside what you think astronomers look like. He was not a quiet monk in a stone observatory. He was not some meek academic scribbling formulas into the night. Tycho was flamboyant. He dueled. He drank. He built his own private island observatory. He kept a pet moose, which reportedly died after getting drunk and falling down a staircase. Born into Danish nobility in 1546, he lived a life far more colorful than most scientists of his day. And yet, despite the eccentricity, Tycho was a genius of staggering precision. His data on planetary motion would become the foundation for the work of his assistant, a man you may have heard of, Johannes Kepler. It was part palace, part laboratory. There were rooms for instruments, quarters for assistants, gardens, even underground passageways, a sort of scientific Hogwarts, centuries ahead of its time, not with telescopes but with enormous quadrants, sextants, and sighting tools of his own design. The event, predicted with eerie accuracy, changed his life over decades. These records would become the gold standard of celestial mapping. This contradicted the long-held belief that the heavens were unchanging. Aristotle's idea of a fixed, perfect sky was now in doubt. Tycho, deeply offended, left Denmark in a storm of pride and indignation. From that point on, he dedicated himself to the skies. He studied law, as expected, but secretly obsessed over the heavens. He charted the sky for decades night after night without the aid of a telescope. Though less powerful than he once was, Tycho was still respected. But Tycho's life wasn't just about stars. It was about power, pride, and ultimately, pressure. Etiquette was strict. Once seated, it was considered deeply impolite almost. Dishonorable, to excuse oneself to use the chamber pot. As a boy, Tycho was taken from his parents by a wealthy uncle. Not uncommon practice among Danish nobility, meant to ensure proper education and social status. At age 14, he witnessed a solar eclipse. By his mid-20s, Tycho had already made waves across Europe for observing a supernova, what he called a new star, in 1572. But over the next 10 days, his condition worsened. He developed. Tycho had seen it with his own eyes, and he had the records to prove it, with royal backing from the King of Denmark. Tycho built a massive observatory on the island of Hvan. He named it Uraniborg, Castle of the Heavens. Nothing worked. It was the most advanced astronomical facility in Europe. A man who mapped the stars, laid low by social convention and a misbehaving org. There, Tycho compiled the most accurate and extensive data set of planetary positions the world had ever seen. He was obsessed with precision, all the while. The pressure in his bladder building, sharp and unrelenting. He measured positions to within arc-minute slivers of the sky, thinner than a fingernail. But the stars would not protect him from politics. When his royal patron died, the new king, less impressed with Tycho's personality and expenses, cut his funding. After years of wandering, he found refuge in Prague. Under the patronage of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, he brought his data, his instruments, and his sharp temper. He also brought along a brilliant, somewhat awkward assistant, Johannes Kepler. The two men clashed. Constantly, Tycho was secretive and controlling, while Kepler, younger and fiercely intellectual, wanted full access to Tycho's notes. Their relationship was tense, but productive. It was this final chapter of Tycho's life that would cement his place in history. But then came the banquet. On October 13th, 1601, Tycho attended a formal dinner at the court of a nobleman in Prague. So Tycho didn't. He sat through the meal and through the after-dinner conversation. When he finally returned home late that night, he found he could no longer urinate at all. At first, he believed it would pass. His belly swelled. His face turned pale. Doctors, limited by the medical knowledge of the age, could do little. Some tried bloodletting. On October 24, 1601, Tycho Brahe died. Official cause a ruptured bladder. All because he held his pee too long at dinner. It's a grimly comic end for such a towering intellect. But like many historical deaths, the cause has been debated. By the time Tycho Brahe took to his deathbed in late October of 1601, Prague's autumn chill had already begun to creep into the halls of the castle. The once proud astronomer lay in discomfort and confusion, murmuring fragments of equations and apologies. One of the last things he reportedly whispered was, "Me frustra. Let me not seem to have lived in vain." It was a curious final plea, not of fear, but of legacy, because Tycho knew something few others did. He had in his possession the most detailed and precise astronomical observations ever recorded by human hands. And he knew that if he died before arranging them into theory, they might be lost, misused, or forgotten, which is why, at his bedside, stood a man who had waited for access to that data for years. Johannes Kepler. Kepler had come to Tycho's court. Unlike Tycho's hybrid model, where the Earth stood still and the Sun orbited it while the planets orbited the Sun, it was a compromise Tycho had built to avoid religious conflict with both Catholic and Lutheran authorities. Really, after years of frustration in Graz, with his unorthodox views had made him unwelcome, he believed in a sun-centered universe. Kepler, bold and mathematical, wanted no compromises. He was determined to prove the sun's centrality through geometry and logic. But for that, he needed data. Tycho's data. And Tycho wasn't eager to share. Their partnership was strained from the start. There were legal obstacles. Planets moved faster when closer to the sun, slower when further away. It wasn't mystical. It was mechanical, predictable. Rival claims. They paved the way for Newton's theory of gravity. They helped explain tides, orbits, and celestial mechanics for the next 4 centuries. Suspicion from Tycho's family and assistants. But over time, Kepler secured the notes, mountains of them, covering decades of nightly observations. A full partner, maybe even an heir, wrote in private letters that he felt like a dog beneath the dinner table, waiting for crumbs. Tycho, territorial and proud, kept his best numbers to himself, sharing only scraps. Kepler, increasingly frustrated, he doubted Copernicus's model and built his own geo-heliocentric system to bridge ancient belief and new evidence. He remained a man of compromise avant as he reached for revolution. And yet, Tycho had begun to recognize Kepler's genius. In 2010, a team of scientists exhumed Tycho's body to test for mercury poisoning, speculating that he might have been poisoned, perhaps by a rival, or even by Kepler. Probably more mundane, a bladder infection, left untreated, a painful death, the tragic cost of etiquette. He lived lavishly. He hosted banquets under the stars. His observatory was not just a laboratory, it was a statement. He intended, perhaps, eventually to make him a collaborator. But death, as it often does, arrived before clarity. He tracked planetary motion so closely that the margin of error in his records was smaller than what many would achieve, even with telescopes, a century later. In the days after Tycho's passing, Kepler gained access to the records. It wasn't instantaneous. He dug in. We are, without realizing it, tracing the outlines of Tycho's life's work, and slowly, carefully, began building something extraordinary. For the rest of his life, he wore a prosthetic. Some said it was silver, others gold. A more recent examination of his remains suggests it was actually brass, likely coated in precious metals. From Tycho's meticulous tracking of Mars, Kepler began to see patterns, not circles, as tradition and Ptolemaic orthodoxy insisted, but ellipses. By 1609, Kepler published his Astronomia Nova, the new astronomy, which included the first two of his now famous laws of planetary motion. Later, he would add a third. These laws reshaped astronomy forever, and none of it would have been possible without Tycho's measurements. It's a strange legacy. Tycho himself never embraced helium, but by preserving accuracy over ideology, Tycho ensured that future minds like Kepler could go further. He didn't climb the mountain, but he built the stairs. And still, the manner of his death haunted people. How could a man so brilliant, so exacting, die because of something as absurd as not excusing himself during dinner? Some modern researchers believe the bladder rupture story is plausible. Others suggest uremia or kidney stones, but the mercury levels, while elevated, weren't high enough to suggest foul play. The truth, and then there's the matter of the nose. Tycho had lost a portion of his nose in the dual decades, earlier reportedly over a mathematical disagreement with another student. He carried that wound for the rest of his days, Amar. A pride, foolishness, and vanity. Much like his legacy, because Tycho Brahe wasn't just a man of numbers. He was a man of theater. He insisted on being addressed with noble titles. And yet, beneath all the excess, was a mind obsessed with precision. He cataloged over 700 stars. His instruments, hand-built and calibrated, were marvels of engineering. And while he clung to an outdated cosmology, his commitment to evidence made him an unlikely midwife to modern science. So now, when we speak of Kepler's laws, or Newton's breakthroughs, or even the orbits calculated by NASA spacecraft, his data still underpins the modern understanding of the solar system. And it all came from a man with a brass nose, a pet elk, and a bladder that betrayed him. So we ask, can greatness be undone by something so small? Does a life's worth of genius lose its weight because of a foolish dinner? Or does it remind us that even the brightest minds, those who map the stars, remain bound by the frailties of flesh? The stars hadn't changed. They still wheeled across the night sky, silent and eternal, just as they had for Tycho Brahe. Each night he stood at his quadrant. The constellations rose in their old patterns. Tycho's notes, diagrams, and precise observations became a kind of sky themselves, fixed, luminous, and unmovable, guiding future generations of scientists for centuries. He continued, refining and reorganizing the massive trove of data left behind by his former mentor. This eventually led to the Rudolphine Tabuza Comprehensive Star Catalog and Planetary Ephemeris, named after Emperor Rudolph II. Mars and Venus traced their ancient arcs, but the man who had mapped them with such obsession was gone buried under Broga soil, his artificial nose folded forever in gold-lined silence. They offered precise predictions of planetary positions, eclipses, and celestial events. Sailors, navigators, and future astronomers would all rely on its contents. And yet, in a sense, he had become one with those stars, not in a poetic or spiritual way, but in the sheer permanence of his work. He proved that the planets moved in ellipses, not circles. That orbits changed speed, depending on distance from the sun. His work stripped the heavens of their perfect symmetry but replaced it with something more precise. After Tycho's death, Johannes Kepler did not waste time. In addition to publishing his own Astronomia Nova, But Tycho taught that the universe is built on patient observation, on meticulous notes taken every single night, even when nothing seems to change. Tycho's hybrid model of the universe, the one where Earth remained still while planets orbited the sun, was quietly retired. It had always been a compromise, designed to respect religious orthodoxy, while still accounting for Copernicus' discoveries. When published in 1627, the Rudolphine tables were the most accurate astronomical reference ever created. The irony, the bladder, the banquet, but few outside scholarly circles remembered Tycho's name. The ideas were moving forward past him. In a strange irony, Kepler, however, had no interest in compromise. Later, Newton would build on Kepler's work to define gravity itself. He was both a servant of the heavens and a creature of earth, flawed, mortal, eccentric, each step further away from Tycho's own cosmology, but never away from his data. In this way, Tycho became something rarer than a founder. He became a foundation in discipline, in the value of looking carefully, even when others don't. When people look to the stars, they often seek drama, exploding supernova, distant galaxies, planetary alignments. He showed that the pursuit of truth doesn't always require wild theories or bold declarations. But without him, none of those things would have happened when they did. Sometimes it requires just watching the sky again and again until patterns emerge. In textbooks, in dusty observatory plaques, there's even a supernova remnant supernova named after the event he witnessed in 1572. It's easy to laugh at the story of his death, and it is strange tragic. Even that such a towering intellect could be felled by something so embarrassingly human. But maybe that's exactly the point, because Tycho Brahe, for all his brilliance, was deeply human. It was vain, theatrical, proud. He believed in omens. He dueled over equations. He hosted scholars and nobility alike with excessive flair. And in that contradiction, he became unforgettable. What can we take from a man like Tycho? Not a worldview. His was already outdated by the time he died. Not a clean legacy. Kepler, Newton, and Galileo all stepped past him. But something quieter, a lesson in rigor. Tycho didn't invent the telescope. He didn't redefine physics. He was the hinge between ancient skies and modern space. Today, Tycho Brahe's name survives in craters on the Moon and Mars. And yes, even in jokes about bladders and duels and moose, because history doesn't always remember you the way you might want, but it remembers. You look up now, on a clear night, somewhere above you, the same stars Tycho saw unchanged by time burn. They know nothing of gold noses or royal banquets, but you do. You know what it costs to see them so clearly. So we ask, does a life need to end in glory to be meaningful? Or is it enough that one man watched the sky so closely that he made it possible for the rest of us to understand where we are?